There's a quiet embarrassment at the center of modern quantum physics. It's rarely mentioned outside academic circles, and when it is, it's often softened with abstractions or confusing mathematical language, but the problem itself is pretty blunt. According to our most successful physical theory, reality does not fully exist until it's observed. Quantum mechanics, unlike classical physics, doesn't describe objects as having definite properties at all times. Instead, it describes them with a mathematical entity called a wave function. This wave function doesn't tell us where a particle is or what it's doing. It just tells us what the particle could be doing. Multiple positions, multiple states, multiple outcomes, all covered by the wave function all at once. This condition is called superposition, and it does work mathematically. The predictions derived from it are so accurate that nearly all modern technology depends on them. Transistors, lasers, MRI machines, and even GPS systems, they all rely on quantum principles. So the theory isn't speculative, it's precise, it's testable, and most importantly, it is overwhelmingly successful. And yet, it contains within it a fundamental fracture. When a quantum system is not observed, it evolves smoothly according to the Schrödinger equation. Nothing dramatic happens and all its possibilities coexist. But the moment a measurement is made, the wave function collapses. One outcome becomes real while all the other outcomes vanish. And the problem isn't that this is happening. The problem is that quantum mechanics never explain how or why it happens, and this is known as the measurement problem. In classical physics, measurement is passive. A thermometer does not create temperature. A ruler does not create length. They reveal properties that were already there. Quantum mechanics breaks this assumption. Before measurement, properties are not merely unknown, they are undefined. The act of measurement does not reveal reality, it appears to create it. To avoid confronting this directly, early physicists adopted what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation. In this view, quantum mechanics does not describe reality itself, it only describes our knowledge of reality. Asking what a particle really is before measurement is considered meaningless. Reality, in this framework, is inseparable from observation. And for a while, this philosophical retreat was tolerated. The math worked out, and the predictions were correct. But one question adamantly refused to stay buried. What exactly then counts as an observation? This question becomes unavoidable when you follow the measurement chain carefully. A particle interacts with the measuring device. The measuring device interacts with the detector. The detector produces a signal. The signal is processed by electronics. The electronics produce data. The data is then displayed on a screen. Light from the screen is entering your human eye. Neural signals travel to the brain, and somewhere along this chain, the wave function stops evolving smoothly and collapses into a single outcome. Well, where in that chain does that transition occur? Well, physicist John von Neumann formalized this problem in what is now called the von Neumann chain. His analysis showed that mathematically every physical component of the measurement process can be treated as a quantum system. The measuring device does not escape superposition, neither does the detector, and neither does the brain, and so on, at least in principle. If you treat all physical systems consistently, well, the chain never breaks. Unless something non-physical intervenes. Von Neumann's conclusion was not mystical, but it was unsettling. He suggested that the only place the collapse could occur without contradiction is at the level of conscious awareness itself, not at the instrument, not at the brain as a physical object, but at the moment you experience that observation. And I don't think I need to say, but this idea was not embraced enthusiastically. It was tolerated at first, but then quietly ignored. but it never fully disappeared because the logic behind it was difficult to refute. Eugene Wigner sharpened the problem with a now famous thought experiment. Imagine a friend in a sealed laboratory measuring a quantum particle. Inside the room, the friend observes a definite result. Outside the room, you have no access to that information, and from your perspective, the entire lab, including the friend, must be treated as a quantum system. That system evolves into a superposition itself. The friend is seeing result A, and then the friend seeing result B are both technically, for you, happening at the same time. Now, if you eventually open the lab to see the result that your friend got, when did that collapse happen? Was it when your friend first looked at the result, or was it when you learned what your friend saw? If consciousness is what causes that collapse, then the answer depends on whose consciousness counts as the true observer. If the friend's observation collapses the wave function, then from your perspective, collapse happened without your knowledge or your observation. However, if collapse requires your awareness as friend B, then your friend A existed in a superposition until you opened the door or asked the question. And frankly, both options are disturbing. One implies that reality is observer-dependent. The other implies that even conscious observers can exist in superposition. Wigner himself took the problem seriously. For a time, he openly argued that consciousness must play a fundamental role in physics. Later in life, he softened his position, but he never resolved that paradox. So this is where physics collides with another unresolved problem, this time from neuroscience and from philosophy. Even if we set quantum mechanics aside, consciousness itself is not well understood. Neuroscience excels at explaining mechanisms. Neurons fire, signals propagate. Networks process information. You damage a region of the brain, and specific functions are lost. These correlations are robust and very well documented. But why does neural activity produce subjective experience? Why is there an inner world at all? Why does information processing feel like anything from the inside? This is known as the hard problem of consciousness, and it is not a gap in the data, it's a gap in our ability to explain. A computer can process information, recognize faces, generate language, and outperform humans at complex tasks. But no amount of functional description explains why redness feels red, why pain hurts, or why awareness exists as a first-person phenomenon rather than a third-person process. Classical physics describes systems from the outside. Consciousness is known only from the inside. And this mismatch has led some researchers to an uncomfortable conclusion. If consciousness cannot be reduced to classical computation, and if quantum mechanics already requires an observer-like role to explain how reality becomes definite, then perhaps these two problems aren't separate. Perhaps consciousness is not an emergent afterthought in a mechanical universe, but a missing piece of its foundation. Now, this does not mean that consciousness is magical or supernatural. It means that our current picture of reality may be incomplete in a way that excludes the very thing doing the observing. So the question then is not whether consciousness is mysterious. The question is whether a universe described entirely by blind mechanical laws can ever account for the fact that it is being experienced at all. The strange thing is, this isn't just a problem for physics. Because outside the laboratory, we live inside systems of observation every day. Not wave functions and detectors, but algorithms, data brokers, surveillance networks, who are observing our every digital move. In the quantum world, the act of measurement is what forces reality into something definite. And in the digital world, something similar happens. The more you're tracked, the more you're categorized, profiled into a little digital box that they use to sell us ads, and sometimes even worse. If you've ever wondered how scammers can find out your name, your address, your search history, and
online behavior. It's because of these data brokers that they gather and aggregate your information. That's why today's sponsor, Incogni, exists. Incogni is a service that automatically removes your personal information from the places that you can't see. Data brokers, people search sites, predatory directories, all the hidden corners of the internet where your identity is quietly being traded for profit. Doing this yourself would take weeks or even months, but Incogni handles it automatically and continuously, keeping your data out of the hands of bad actors. And with their new custom removals feature, you can take it even further. Just Google yourself, find a site exposing your information, copy the link, and Incogni's privacy experts will work to have it removed, even from sites that are outside of their automated network. So, if you want to reduce how much of your life is being measured, tracked, and turned into someone else's product, go to incogni.com/aperture deal and use the code Aperture Deal to get 60% off an annual plan and keep your information out of the hands of people who want to harm you. Because they can't harm you if they can't find you. Back to our story.
The physical mechanism, how the brain might escape classical computation. If consciousness truly has something to do with quantum mechanics, then the claim cannot remain philosophical. It has to interact with the physical world, it has to stand up and be tested, and it has to explain how a biological organ operating at body temperature could participate in phenomena usually reserved for subatomic particles. Otherwise, the idea collapses into nothing more than a metaphor. Roger Penrose, a mathematician disturbed by this limitation that most people would never even notice, explained that the starting point is not the brain, computation is. Modern neuroscience is largely built on an assumption inherited from computer science, that the brain is, at its core, an information processing machine. Consciousness, in this view, is what it feels like to run a sufficiently complex algorithm. Penrose rejected this assumption on mathematical grounds. His argument, hinging on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, results from mathematical logic that places strict limits on formal systems. Gödel showed that any sufficiently powerful logical system will contain true statements that cannot be proven within the system itself. No matter how complete the rules seem, there will always be truths that escape mechanical derivation. Penrose noticed something unsettling about this. Human mathematicians can see the truth of certain statements that no algorithm can formally prove, not by brute force calculation, but by insight, by understanding. If human understanding were fully equivalent to an algorithm, then humans would be bound by the same limitations as formal systems. Yet, in practice, they're not. They can step outside the system, recognize its structure, and grasp truths that the system cannot certify. Penrose's conclusion was not that humans are magical. It was that human understanding is not computable. It cannot be reduced to a classical algorithm running on biological hardware. If that is true, then the brain is not functioning like a digital computer. And if it isn't classical, then it must be doing something else. Penrose proposed that the something else lies in quantum physics, but not in the usual way that people imagine. Not random quantum noise, not vague mysticism either. A very specific process built into the fabric of space-time itself. In standard quantum physics, wave function collapse is treated as a rule. You observe the system and the probabilities become facts. But Penrose found this deeply unsatisfying. It relies on measurement without explaining what measurement fundamentally is. Instead, he proposed that collapse is a real physical process called objective reduction. The idea is simple. According to general relativity, mass and energy curve space-time. According to quantum mechanics, particles can exist in superposition. But if an object is in two places at once, then space-time itself must also be in a superposition of two different geometries. Penrose argued that space-time cannot tolerate this indefinitely. Beyond a certain threshold, the superposition becomes unstable and then collapses on its own. No observer required, no measurement device, just gravity enforcing consistency. And this collapse is not subjective, it is objective. It happens whether anyone is watching or not. And crucially, Penrose proposed that each such collapse corresponds to a moment of conscious experience. At this point, the theory needed a brain. Penrose understood physics, but he did not know where such quantum processors could occur in neurons. That is where Stuart Hameroff enters the picture. Hameroff is an anesthesiologist, not a physicist. His interest in consciousness came from an unusual direction: anesthesia. General anesthetics reliably erase consciousness while leaving most neural processing intact. Patients can still have brain activity, reflexes, and even memory encoding under certain conditions. What disappears is subjective experience itself. Hameroff noticed something strange in this. Anesthetics did not primarily target synapses, action potentials, or large-scale neural signaling. Instead, they bound preferentially to structures inside neurons called microtubules. Microtubules are part of the cell's internal skeleton. They give neurons their shape, transport materials, and organize intracellular processes. For decades, they were considered structural scaffolding, important but not informational. Now, Hameroff suspected otherwise. Microtubules are made of repeating protein units arranged in a highly ordered lattice. At very small scales, this lattice resembles a crystal. And crystals, under the right conditions, can support coherent quantum states. Together, Penrose and Hameroff proposed orchestrated objective reduction, or ORC-OR. The idea is that microtubules act as quantum information processors. Within their lattice, components can exist in superpositions functioning as quantum bits rather than classical ones. These superpositions evolve coherently for a brief period orchestrated by the brain's neural activity. When the superposition reaches Penrose's gravitational threshold, it undergoes objective reduction. The collapse is not random noise, it is structured, shaped by the geometry of space-time itself. Each collapse produces a discrete moment of experience. Consciousness, in this model, is not continuous. It is a sequence of quantum events. A rapid series of collapses, often described metaphorically as moments or frames, occurring roughly 40 times per second. Now, this would explain several otherwise puzzling features of experience. The unity of consciousness, the suddenness of insight, the way awareness feels discrete yet seamless. Even the temporal binding problem, how different sensory inputs are experienced as a single moment. For decades, this theory was dismissed for one simple reason. The brain is warm, wet, and very, very noisy. Quantum coherence is fragile. In laboratories, it typically requires extreme isolation and near absolute zero temperatures. In the brain, your molecules are vibrating, ions are flowing, and thermal noise dominates. Any delicate quantum state should decohere almost instantly. So, ORC-OR seemed dead on arrival. But biology has a habit of exploiting physical effects in ways physics does not expect. In the early 2000s, researchers studying photosynthesis discovered something surprising. Energy transfer in plant cells showed signatures of quantum coherence. Excited electrons explored multiple paths simultaneously, selecting the most efficient route through superposition at room temperature. So quantum biology was no longer just hypothetical. In comes anesthesia research. Experiments showed that anesthetics disrupted microtubule function in ways consistent with interference in quantum-level processes. Consciousness disappeared when microtubule dynamics were altered, even though large-scale neural firing could remain. More recently, studies have suggested that microtubules may support a phenomenon known as superradiance. In very simple terms, this allows many quantum components to act as a single coherent system, amplifying and stabilizing quantum effects rather than letting them decay. This matters because it addresses the central criticism to the theory. If microtubules can sustain large-scale coherence through collective behavior, then quantum processes in the brain are no longer obviously impossible. And let's just say right out here, none of this proves that ORC-OR is correct, but it does shift the question. The brain may not be a classical machine with quantum noise layered on top. It may be a system evolved to sit precisely at the boundary where quantum and classical physics meet. If that boundary is where reality becomes definite, then the brain is not just processing information, it is participating in the same processes that turns possibility into reality. Which raises a final destabilizing thought. If the brain uses quantum mechanics not just internally, but relationally, through entanglement and non-locality, then consciousness may not be confined to the skull at all. The connection to the universe when the mind is no longer local. Up to this point, the discussion has remained uncomfortable but contained. Consciousness may rely on quantum processes. The brain may operate at a boundary classical physics does not describe well. These ideas stretch neuroscience, but they don't yet rupture our sense of personal identity. That rupture happens when non-locality enters the picture. Quantum mechanics does not merely allow strange behavior at small scales. It violates one of the most intuitive assumptions humans have ever held, that objects exist independently and that influence travels locally through space. Entanglement is the clearest expression of this violation. When two quantum systems interact, they can become entangled, meaning their properties are no longer independent. If you measure one and the state of the other is immediately constrained, no matter how far apart they are. This correlation is not mediated by signals traveling through space. It is built into the structure of the shared quantum state itself. Einstein found this intolerable. He called it spooky action at a distance, and this wasn't as praise, this was a warning. However, decades of experiments have confirmed entanglement as a real feature of the world and not a mathematical trick. The uncomfortable implication is this. The universe is not composed of separate things interacting across space. At the deepest level, it is a network of relationships that ignore distance entirely. If consciousness depends on quantum processes, then it does not merely occur within the universe. It participates in the same non-local structure that underlies all physical reality. This isn't poetry, it's a structural claim. In classical neuroscience, the brain is modular. Regions perform tasks, signals propagate. Information is localized. Consciousness, in this view, is an emergent summary, a story that the brain tells itself about its own activity. Quantum systems do not behave this way. They are unified. You cannot fully describe one part without referencing the whole. This raises a radical possibility. Consciousness may not arise from isolated computations inside the skull, but from coherent processes that bind the brain into a single quantum system. There are tentative experimental hints pointing in this direction. Researchers have long struggled to explain how the brain integrates information so seamlessly. Visual input, auditory input, memory, emotion, and bodily sensation, they're processed in different regions, yet experienced as a single moment. This is known as the binding problem. Classical explanations rely on synchrony and signaling, but synchrony alone does not explain unity. It explains coordination, but not experience. Quantum coherence offers a different mechanism. Entangled systems behaving as one system even when they are spatially distributed. Recent MRI-based studies have suggested correlations between distant regions of the brain that are difficult to account for purely classically. These correlations are not proof of entanglement in the strict quantum sense, but they do hint at deeper integration than standard models predict. If microtubules can sustain coherent quantum states, and if those states span large neural networks, then consciousness may be a genuinely unified physical process, not an illusion layered over fragmentation. And this has consequences beyond neuroscience. Quantum theory already forces us to reconsider the role of the observer. In the standard view, the universe evolves according to deterministic equations until a measurement occurs. Then, something then selects one outcome from many. The question has always been, what performs the selection? If conscious systems are themselves quantum systems, and if their awareness corresponds to objective reductions in space-time geometry, then consciousness is not a passive witness. It is an active participant in the unfolding of reality. This idea is sometimes called the participatory universe. This phrase might sound wishy-washy, but I assure you it's real science. It describes a universe in which reality is not fully defined without interaction. Observers are not external to the system. They are part of the mechanism by which the universe becomes specific rather than indefinite. In such a universe, consciousness does not merely observe events. It helps actualize them. This does not mean human minds can control reality at will. Quantum processes are constrained, probabilistic, and subtle, but it does mean that awareness is not an afterthought. The boundary between mind and world becomes more porous. Objects appear separate because decoherence hides their connections, not because these connections are non-existent. In that sense, consciousness may be local only in appearance. A conscious system may be anchored to a brain, but not confined to it in the way that classical intuition demands. Its underlying processes may be entangled with broader quantum fields, participating in structures far larger than the organism itself. Or, in layman's terms, your brain might just be connected to the universe. The feeling of being a self, located behind the eyes, observing the world from a single point in space, may be a useful interface rather than a literal description of the true nature of consciousness. A way of navigating a reality that is fundamentally non-local without being totally overwhelmed by it. At this point, the conversation does begin to drift away from conventional physics and towards more radical frameworks. But these frameworks didn't arise from mysticism. They arose from attempts to take quantum mechanics seriously all the way down. One such framework begins with a blunt evolutionary claim. If perception evolved for survival rather than truth, then the world you experience is not reality as it is reality as it's useful. And if that's the case, then space-time itself may not be fundamental at all. Radical alternatives when reality is no longer what it seems. At a certain depth, attempts to explain consciousness stop feeling like extensions of neuroscience and begin to resemble reconstructions of reality itself. The assumptions that once felt stable, space, time, objects, even causality, begin to dissolve under scrutiny. One of the most direct challenges comes from an unexpected place: evolutionary theory. Donald Hoffman approaches the problem of perception with a simple but unsettling premise. Natural selection does not reward organisms for seeing the truth. It rewards them for surviving long enough to reproduce. Accuracy is irrelevant unless it increases your chances of survival. From this, Hoffman derives a result that feels almost, frankly, offensive to common sense. If a species evolved to see reality as it truly is, rather than as a simplified interface optimized for survival, it would be outcompeted and then eliminated. Truth is expensive. Illusion? It's efficient. In this framework, perception is not a window into reality, it's a user interface. Just as a computer desktop hides voltage, transistors, and machine code behind icons and folders, our senses hide the underlying structure of the universe behind space, time, objects, and causality. A chair is not a thing in itself. It's an icon representing something useful to sit on. A car isn't metal and engine and motion. It's an interface object, signaling either danger or opportunity, depending on whether you're inside the car or standing in front of it. The key implication is this: space-time itself may be a part of that interface. Hoffman argues that if space-time were fundamental, evolution would have no reason to hide it. The fact that our perceptions are spatial, temporal, and object-based suggests that these are not features of reality, but of the interface through which we interact with it. So, the question is, what exists beneath the interface? In Hoffman's model, the fundamental constituents of reality are conscious agents, not human minds, but minimal units of experience and decision. These agents interact, form networks, and generate the structures that we perceive as physical reality. Matter does not give rise to consciousness. Consciousness gives rise to the appearance of matter. This isn't panpsychism in the usual sense. Hoffman is not claiming that electrons have feelings or that rocks are secretly aware. He's claiming that what we call physical objects are emergent symbols, compressed representations of interactions between conscious systems that we cannot perceive directly. In this view, you are not a body that produces consciousness. You are a localized perspective within a much larger field of interacting awareness. The brain, then, is not the generator of experience. It's a part of the interface, like a VR headset worn by consciousness to navigate a particular slice of our reality. This idea aligns uncomfortably well with quantum mechanics. The observer-dependent nature of measurement, the breakdown of locality, the inability to define properties without interaction, all of these suggest that reality is relational rather than objective in a classical sense. But Hoffman's model still assumes one universe. Another interpretation takes a more drastic step. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics begins with a refusal. It refuses to accept wave function collapse at all. Instead, it takes the mathematics literally. According to this view, the wave function never collapses. Every possible outcome of a quantum event occurs. When a measurement happens, the universe branches. One branch contains outcome A. Another contains outcome B. Both are real, they're simply not interacting. There's no special role for observation, no moment where possibility becomes actuality. Reality continuously differentiates. This interpretation solves the measurement problem by eliminating it. There's no collapse to explain, it only branches. But it introduces a new discomfort. If every possible outcome occurs, then there are versions of you who made different choices, survived different accidents, and died in many different ways. At every moment, reality fractures into countless paths. Most of these paths are unobservable to you, but some aren't. This leads to a disturbing philosophical extrapolation known as quantum immortality. Consider a thought experiment involving a lethal quantum device, often framed as a quantum Russian roulette. A trigger is pulled. A quantum event determines whether the gun fires. In many branches of the universe, it does. In some, it doesn't. From the outside, an observer sees death almost every time. From the inside, though, something strange is happening. Consciousness cannot experience its own absence. Try imagining just not being. You probably had difficulty because you can't. There is no subjective moment of being dead. So awareness continues only in branches where survival occurs. From your perspective, you always hear the click, but never the gunshot. Over repeated trials, the odds of your survival become astronomically small, but subjectively, survival feels guaranteed. So if many worlds is correct, then consciousness is biased towards branches where it continues, not because of fate or design, but because branches without experience are unexperienced. Now, this does not mean you are invincible. It means that from your point of view, you only ever find yourself in timelines where you remain alive until aging, disease, or gradual degradation erodes the conditions necessary for awareness. But even then, the implications remain unsettling. In this framework, death is not a single event, it's a distribution, a gradual thinning of branches where experience persists. Identity becomes fluid, continuity becomes conditional, and the universe becomes vast beyond comprehension, not just in space, but in possibility. At this stage, the idea of consciousness as a local phenomenon begins to feel inadequate. Whether through Hoffman's conscious agents or Everett's branching worlds, awareness appears less like a byproduct and more like a structural feature, something that does not sit neatly inside of space-time but uses space-time as one of its expressions. Now, let's pull back for a moment. These ideas are not proven, and many physicists reject them. Others tolerate them as philosophical interpretations with no testable consequences. But notice what they have in common. They all arise from taking quantum mechanics seriously without retreating into classical intuition. They all suggest that reality is not composed of objects but of processes, not of things but of relationships. Not matter first, but information, interaction, and experience. And they all converge on the same unsettling possibility: that consciousness is not an accident occurring inside the universe. It may be one of the ways the universe exists at all. All that remains is to step back and ask what this synthesis means and what it doesn't. Synthesis. What changes when the mind is no longer secondary? At this point, it becomes tempting to reach for resolution, to decide which theory is correct, which interpretation survives scrutiny, which framework deserves to replace the old one. But that impulse itself reflects a habit inherent from classical thinking, the belief that reality must collapse into a single clean answer. Well, quantum mechanics has taught us otherwise. There is no consensus on quantum consciousness. OR remains controversial. Many neuroscientists reject it as unnecessary. Many physicists remain skeptical that gravity-induced collapse has anything to do with experience. Hoffman's conscious agents are mathematically elegant but empirically distant. Many worlds removes collapse but multiplies realities beyond intuitive tolerance. None of these views has won. And yet, something important has already changed. The question is no longer about whether consciousness fits neatly into the existing scientific picture. It doesn't. The question is whether the picture itself was ever complete without it. Classical physics gives us a universe made of objects, moving through space, evolving through time, indifferent to observation. Consciousness in that universe was an anomaly, an emergent side effect of sufficiently complex machinery, a late arrival, a byproduct. Quantum mechanics undermined that narrative at its foundation. The universe, at its most precise description, is not a collection of things with fixed properties. It is a structure of probabilities, relationships, and potentialities. Outcomes do not exist until something distinguishes them. The very act of defining what is depends on interaction. This does not prove that consciousness creates reality, but it strongly suggests that reality cannot be fully defined without accounting for the role of observation, perspective, and information. In neuroscience, a similar shift is underway. The brain is no longer viewed as a simple stimulus response machine. It's predictive, integrative, and deeply context sensitive. Experience is not passively received, it's actively constructed. If quantum processes play even a partial role in this construction, then consciousness is not merely running on top of physics, it's entangled with it. That entanglement carries consequences. It means the boundary between the mind and world is not as firm as it feels. It means the sense of being, an isolated self sealed inside a body and looking out at an external universe, may be a perceptual convenience rather than a fundamental truth. It also means that many familiar debates may have been misframed. The argument over whether consciousness is in the brain or beyond the brain assumes that location works the way that classical intuition says it does. Quantum mechanics does not respect that intuition, neither increasingly does biology. The argument over whether free will is an illusion assumes that causality flows cleanly from past to future. Quantum processes complicate that picture. So does the role of indeterminacy in physical law. Even the fear embedded in ideas like quantum immortality reveals something very, very important. It exposes how tightly personal identity is tied to continuity, memory, and narrative. If you strip those away, and survival becomes less reassuring, not more. What remains consistent across all these frameworks is not certainty, but displacement. The brain stops looking like a self-contained machine and starts looking like an interface. Consciousness stops looking like a private hallucination and starts looking like a relational phenomenon. The universe stops looking like a finished object and starts looking like an ongoing process. This does not mean that meaning is guaranteed. It does not imply purpose, destiny, or cosmic benevolence. Those interpretations are human additions, not scientific conclusions. What it does mean is quieter and more unsettling. It means that the deepest problem in science, the relationship between mind and matter, may not be solved by reducing one to the other. Reduction works when the parts are more fundamental than the whole. Quantum theory suggests that in some cases the whole defines the parts. If that's true, then consciousness may not be something the universe accidentally produced. It may be, maybe, one of the ways the universe differentiates itself. Not a ruler standing outside reality, measuring it, not a ghost haunting matter, but a process through which potential becomes experience. And that idea resists closure. It refuses a final, comforting answer. It sits uncomfortably between physics and philosophy, between experiments and introspection. And you know what? Hey, maybe that's the point. The mistake may have been expecting consciousness to fit inside a worldview built to exclude it. Expecting subjectivity to be explained entirely in terms of objects. Expecting experience to emerge cleanly from equations that never mention it. Quantum mechanics did not introduce consciousness into science. It exposed that consciousness had been quietly ignored. What comes next is uncertain. New experiments may falsify these ideas. Better theories may replace them. Or the mystery may deepen further. But the direction that everything is moving is already clear. We are moving away from a universe where the mind is an accident and towards one where observation, information, and experience are woven into the fabric of what exists. Not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a reminder that the world is stranger than the stories that we tell ourselves to make it manageable, and that the act of telling those stories is itself part of the phenomenon that we are trying to understand.